I've seen a few Buddhist teachers on YouTube talking about whether or not Buddhism is an antinatalist philosophy. And I have to say, I think their answers are not entirely consistent with the standard Buddhist teachings. And I think it's obvious that Buddhism is antinatalist, or at least there are some good reasons to think antinatalism is the most consistent position to reach in line with Buddhist teachings. And yeah, I'm pretty skeptical about why they say otherwise. I feel like people who are into religions and get attached to that religion and its success may often feel the need to dress it up and to make it more compatible with the social norms of the culture they're selling it to, so that it will spread and they can get people into it. Although I'm aware that, in the case of some Zen Buddhist priests, they actually do have children, which honestly I think is kind of bizarre in line with Buddhist teachings. And in this video I want to explore why, and why a Buddhist might conclude that antinatalism is the position to take and the path to follow. And for those who haven't heard this term, antinatalism is essentially the view that it is morally wrong to reproduce, to create children, and that, perhaps more broadly, a so-called child-free life has a certain wisdom to it and is either better for oneself or somehow more moral. So let's think about Buddhism and its central goals. The central goals of Buddhism are, I would say, twofold as I understand it: the cessation of actions that give rise to suffering, and related to this, the cessation of delusion, and the three poisons of greed, anger, and delusion in total. So the cessation of suffering, that raises two questions, right? When we have children, to what extent does that create suffering? Firstly, for ourselves, and secondly, then, just in the world, creating suffering for others. In this case, primarily the unborn hypothetical child. Now, obviously, it creates suffering. There's even a sutra called, it translates as the embryonic sutra, which argues that suffering occurs even within the womb as the fetus develops. And this teaching is perfectly clear in Buddhism. Buddha described the three marks of existence: impermanence, non-self or lack of self-essence, and dukkha, dissatisfaction. And these three marks of existence are said to stain every moment of conditioned phenomena. That is to say, every moment of experience features these three marks to some extent. So of course, creating a new sentient being where prior there was no sentient being will create suffering, because every moment of their life will involve a certain degree of dukkha. And they will suffer not just from that, but from their relationship to the impermanence that they will encounter. Yeah. You could argue that there's a chance they'll be enlightened, and what a great gift it is for them to be born human, and but let's get real, and this is what the texts say, that it takes hundreds of thousands of rebirths as a human being to reach enlightenment, and the probability of a single human being becoming fully enlightened and ending that dukkha is just astronomically small. I mean, there are 8 billion people on this planet, and how many of them have permanently eliminated their suffering, as is said to be the achievable goal of Buddhism? Very few. So if you're thinking, I'll have a child because they might be able to become enlightened, I hate to tell you this, but it's less likely than you winning the lottery that your child is going to become enlightened and and end all their suffering. Now, 1,000 years ago, you and I both had ancestors who made a choice to fuck and procreate. And between them and where you and I are right now, there is an unbroken chain of striving, discontent, hunger, thirst, fighting, the 1,000 flavors of human suffering. And they didn't just make suffering for the human child that they created. That one choice, to fuck without protection, which didn't exist of course, and to reproduce, has created tens of thousands of human lives and all the suffering that implies. That is an ocean of suffering that hinged on that one choice. How can that be good karma? How can that be good Buddhist practice to create an ocean of suffering? It does not make any sense at all. People are short-sighted, you know. They just think about the generation they're creating rather than their role in an unbroken river of suffering that has unfolded for, well, millions of years since before humans were humans. And this is the other thing. Buddha frequently compares humans and animals and the human and animal state of existence. And it's quite clear that the special thing about being a human is that we can use reason to rise above the same processes that perpetuate that chain of suffering inherent in the lives of animals. Again, that endless striving and fighting, and every organism trying to fight and kill and eat every other organism kind of thing. Like, the special thing about humans is precisely that we can choose to break that chain. And I think a part of breaking that chain is precisely rising above the animal appetites and lusts that otherwise would drive us. Not that I claim to have achieved that or to be a good Buddhist or completely overcome sensual desire or anything like that, but at least I'm not such a bad Buddhist that I will reproduce and inflict life on a non-existing being. Buddha, after he attained enlightenment and became a Buddha, an awakened one, did not reproduce further. Prior to his enlightenment, he had a son, and after he attained enlightenment, he felt that it was important to go and recruit his son into the monastic order and therefore take a vow of celibacy. And incidentally, that vow of celibacy is for the most part seen as quite important in the history of Buddhism, although again we now live in a sex-positive society, and Buddhism came to the West in the 60s, often associated with very sexually liberated people like hippie people who were exploring ideas from the East. And so Buddhism has, I think, been misrepresented as being more sex positive than it ever really was. It was thoroughly sex negative for most of its history, and most of the texts are quite clear in warning about indulgence and sensual pleasure. And yeah, I mean, it seems kind of obvious to me that, yeah, you have like lay Buddhist practitioners, and then you have the real hardcore Buddhists who follow the teachings to their logical corollary and become monks. They don't have sex and they don't reproduce. So this is a kind of indication that Buddhism is, in its extreme form, when you're following it to its logical conclusion, antinatalists. We look at the exemplars of Buddhist practice and they do not reproduce. They don't even have sex. Why don't they have sex? Well, this brings me on to the next point, the Four Noble Truths. It seems obvious that the implications of the Four Noble Truths imply that you should not create children. The Four Noble Truths start off with this proclamation about the nature of suffering permeating existence that I've already really discussed in relation to the 3 marks of existence. But perhaps the main take-home message of the Four Noble Truths is that suffering it is fundamentally caused by either desire or attachment, depending on interpretation and translation. And regardless of whether you want to focus on desire or attachment as the cause of suffering, both of those concepts have clear implications for reproduction. So in the case of desire, if one gets rid of all desires, that does imply that one does not desire children. And if you do not desire children, it's probably best not to have them, because a child that was not desired is probably going to suffer even more than a child who was desired. And a more fundamental point perhaps is that it's quite difficult to create children without desire. Although not impossible, admittedly, it is for the most part our desire for sex and pleasure and sensuality that leads us into going along with the wheel of samsara, being entangled in the samsaric world and the cycle of creation and destruction that Buddhism seems to imply we ought to try to escape. And then there's attachment. If attachment is the cause of suffering, then clearly it's a bad idea to have children, because if you have children, it's highly likely that you will become attached to your children. And if you do not become attached to your children, it's probably not a good idea to have children, because I don't know if it's particularly healthy for kids to have parents incapable of any form of attachment to them. What else? What else do I have to say on this? So when I listen to these arguments of like, okay, why is it a good thing to have, or a permissible thing and a Buddhist thing to have children, they don't really seem very plausible, because they tend to talk about reincarnation and the kind of more metaphysically speculative side of Buddhism, which many Buddhists don't really believe anymore. I mean, maybe if you really see the world that way and you think, well, I better make a child so that disembodied spirit doesn't come back as an animal or an alien in a faraway planet, or whatever it is, or a demon or a hungry ghost or this kind of thing. Maybe if you really believe that you're creating this opportunity for enlightenment that otherwise wouldn't be there, maybe it's consistent. But come on, we are as Buddhists meant to be loyal to the truth, and the truth is that no human being could know that stuff, and so it's reasonable to think that Buddha didn't really literally mean that when he spoke about being reborn as an animal or a hungry ghost, he was perhaps being more metaphorical or allegorical, or perhaps even himself adapting the teachings to the Hindu culture in which he lived. But his teachings on anatman, on the non-existence of a permanent unchanging self, basically make those reincarnation beliefs a little less tenable and consistent. And it just seems highly tenuous. Why did you create an ocean of suffering, our ancestor 1,000 years ago? Oh, well, I just wanted to provide a disembodied spirit with an opportunity for enlightenment. Come off it. Let's think about the real reasons people actually have children. And those real reasons are not, I want to create a vessel for enlightenment for a disembodied spirit. You might choose to dress it up that way, but I don't think anyone's going to buy it. Now, let me remind you, Buddhism is fundamentally concerned with the dispelling of delusion. And this leads me to my final point, really, which is that the motives people have for procreation, when you ask people why they think it's so important to have children, they're stupid, they're delusional. Primarily, it is like a death denial coping mechanism, an immortality project, I think. People want to pass on their DNA because they feel that it will provide some kind of immortality for them. They will leave their genetics behind, and therefore they are immortal. I mean, this is ridiculous, but people believe it. You hear this shit all the time. Like, or they think, if I have children, it will bring a permanent state of satisfaction to my otherwise dissatisfying life. In other words, they hope that by changing their conditions, the condition of not having children to having children, it will help to make them content and bring them peace in their life. This is delusion. There's no research evidence to back this up. On the contrary, it would seem that people who have children, all things being equal, tend to be less satisfied with life. They tend to suffer more. They tend to be more depressed. What a surprise. They have created suffering for themselves by reproducing, but they have also created an ocean of suffering in the form of their new child and the future generations that their children may produce. So it is delusion. Greed, anger, delusion. And I wonder about the role of greed in the choice to reproduce and the other motives people have for reproduction, that need to play the image game of being a success and be normal and like conform to society, just like Buddhist monks do when they retreat to mountain monasteries. It's bullshit. Like, there's so much delusion behind the drive to have children, including the delusion of self and the need to like cheat death and survive death. So, for these reasons, I think that if one wishes to follow the Buddhist path in a consistent fashion, and if one wishes to cease from actions that give rise to suffering for oneself and others, and if one wishes to live a life in line with the truth of things and the way of reality, it would be wise and consistent not to have children.